Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd like to discuss about Second Thessalonians. Is it authentically Pauline, or is it not authentically Pauline? Now, I have here with me N.T Wrights and Michael Bird's The New Testament in Its World, and they argue for its authenticity. And I also have here Raymond Brown's work, who argued for who argued against its authenticity. Um, Now, the New Testament in its world is an evangelical production, yeah, or it's meant, or it's written for a more conservative Christian, evangelical Christian. And Raymond Brown's work here is written um, more for like the mainstream academic audience who accept historical criticism and who have a more quote unquote radical approach. Yeah, even though I would not call it, personally, I would not call it radical approach. I would rather say that this is quite the mainstream approach in academia, okay, whereby we apply historical, literary criticism and things like that. So, both Michael Bird and N.T Wright, they argued for its authenticity. Now, they in page 420 to 421, they gave 4 points here, but the only point of our concern here, because this is the strongest point out of these two, is that its literary features, okay, meaning its writing style, its vocabulary, and things like that. I'm just going to read to you here what they say in page 420. While close literary similarities do exist between the two letters, if 1 and 2 Thessalonians were written close together, these similarities are hardly surprising. Foster comments, it is not impossible that Paul or his scribe retained a copy or a draft of 1 Thessalonians, or perhaps more plausibly, that the two letters were written in a sufficiently close temporal span that key phrases were able to be recalled from memory. The fact that 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are so very different stylistically is much better explained in terms of the horrific experience Paul had just passed through before the second letter. In any case, it seems something of a heads I win, tails you lose argument to say that, for instance, Ephesians and Colossians cannot be by Paul because the style is so different from the other letters, while 2 Thessalonians cannot be by Paul because the style is so similar. Now, out of these 4 arguments, this is the only argument that actually address what majority of the scholars have been saying, and also the strongest points as to what other scholars have been saying um, against the authenticity of 2 Thessalonians. Now, Raymond Brown here, I'm just going to read what Raymond Brown here says. Okay, but before that, N.T Wright and Michael Bird both argued that Second Thessalonians was probably written a few months, okay, after the writing of First Thessalonians, and they quote a person by the name of Foster here. Okay, um, and so they say that it is not impossible, okay, not impossible that Paul or his scribe retain a copy or a draft of 1 Thessalonians, or perhaps more plausibly that the two letters were written in a sufficiently close temporal span. Okay, and this is what they claim, but there is no evidence for that in the first place. There is no evidence for that, and as you will see later on, as I will demonstrate, inshallah, that they built their argument based on false evidence, and then they use their conclusion that is built based on false evidence to refute the scholars that actually present evidence. Um, Raymond Brown, who took a more, I would say, honest approach, okay, and I'll get to this. In page 593, he says that regarding the style and vocabulary arguments, okay, remarkable vocabulary similarities between the two letters exist, as well as notable differences peculiar to Second Thessalonians. Okay, meaning that there are similarities, also differences that are peculiar to Second Thessalonians, meaning unique to itself. In Second Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 3 to 12, the sentences are longer and more complex than in First Thessalonians, so that in this feature Second Thessalonians is close to the statistics of Ephesians and Colossians, while First Thessalonians is close to those of the undisputed Pauline letters. Okay. Second Thessalonian is more formal than 1 Thessalonian in tone. References to Paul's life in Second Thessalonians are less personal, yet that fact might be explicable if Second Thessalonian was written very soon after 1 Thessalonians, and thus there was not a need to reiterate what Paul had done when he first came to Thessalonica. Okay, this is what Michael Burt and N.T Wrights proposes 20 years after Raymond Brown wrote his text. Okay? But as you can see, Raymond Brown itself refuted this opinion. Moreover, this greeting is with my own hand. Paul, this is my mark in every letter. Okay, in every letter. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 17. Certainly the first clause in that sentence favors genuineness. Okay? Raymond Brown here says, if Second Thessalonian is pseudonymous and if the notion of forgery is to be avoided, the writer is symbolically insisting on the genuineness of the message, not on the penmanship. Okay? On the other hand, the second clause may favor pseudonymity, meaning forgery, because it is not written by anyone that is anonymous. Okay, it is claimed to be written by Paul, so that's why it is pseudonymous. On the other hand, the second clause may favor pseudonymity because every letter would be more intelligible after there was a tradition of Paul having written many letters rather than only one letter, which is 1 Thessalonians, which is the sole letter known to have preceded 2 Thessalonians if the letter was written early by Paul. Okay, and so if we look at the argument in itself, N.T Wright and Michael Burt, and I completely disagree with them. Okay, I mean I disagree with their opinion. Okay, I'm not attacking the scholar. Okay? I'm basically addressing what they suggest here. First thing first, they build their evidence on false premise. They built their evidence by suggesting that Second Thessalonians could have probably been written a few months after First Thessalonians, and then Paul and his scribe still have the draft copy and things like that. Well, it is plausible, but there is no evidence. Something that is plausible could also not be plausible, and so this is not a strong foundation for one to build their argument upon, and then to suggest this as a means of refutation to those scholars who insist that Second Thessalonians was not written by Paul. And so they built their strongest argument, which I found in this book. Okay, out of the 4 arguments they listed, number 2 is probably the strongest argument in my opinion. But they built their strongest argument based on false premise. There is no evidence that Second Thessalonians was written probably a few months after First Thessalonians was written. For those of you who do not know, that why scholars reject Second Thessalonians, it is because or why scholars dispute. Okay, I will not say reject, because there's still argument going back and forth between Second Thessalonians and First Thessalonians. Is Second Thessalonians authentically Pauline or is it not? A lot of mainstream scholars who have taken the academic route, like strict, rigorous academic route, they dispute that Second Thessalonians was actually written by Paul, whereas evangelical scholars who have taken the more conservative route, obviously they argue for its authenticity. Okay, because I mean they have taken the more evangelical route. But how do we come to common terms amongst the two? As laymen, which scholars do we follow? Now, I'm not saying that N.T Wright and Michael Bird is mistaken, because, and I'm not also saying that Raymond Brown and as well as other scholars that falls under his camp is absolutely correct. Um, all I'm saying is that as laymen, people like me, how do I decide whether is Second Thessalonians authentically Pauline, or is it not authentically Pauline? I look at the evidence. I look at the evidence at present, um, and I agree with certain conservative scholars based on other points, okay, that they have reasons to argue, um, because they have evidence, and that scholars that have taken the more rigorous academic route, they have approached it in a too skeptical of a manner, um, whereby they suggest that everything is not plausible. Um, but in this case, Second Thessalonians, I found the argument of N.T Wright and Michael Bird absolutely weak, um, because number one, they have built their evidence based on false premise. There is no evidence, and so you cannot really build your or argue your case based on hypothesis and then claim that this has refuted the opinions of other scholars, because first things first, there is no evidence, and so how can you just, this is argument from silence, there is no evidence, whereas there is more evidence, okay, and there is evidence in the text itself that suggests, as Raymond Brown here have suggested, that again, we are, if we, the vocabulary is one thing, the sentences, the sentence structure is a different thing, okay. But if we, that is when we need to look at literary themes and things like that. But number one, based on the narrative itself, the eschatology, the parousia is different. In First Thessalonians, the parousia is imminent, meaning it is coming absolutely soon. But in Second Thessalonians, the parousia has been pushed further away into the future. Okay, and so why is there a change of opinion? And it doesn't make sense to say that Second Thessalonians was probably written a few months, because they would suggest this would actually open up the doors to many huge problems that evangelists themselves do not want to open. And that is because if you say that Paul changes his mind immediately, meaning Paul have made a mistake. And how can Paul make a mistake? Because Paul claimed in himself, okay, that this is, he got his gospel from Jesus, from God. If you, for evangelists, Jesus is God. Okay, second member of the Trinity, okay, the second person sharing the same essence, and so again, how can Paul make a mistake? And so again, they would turn to the arguments between Galatians and Romans, but and they would say that no, Paul did not make a mistake. He clarifies, okay. But we do not see clarifications here between First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians. Rather, we see Second Thessalonians refuting the parousia claim of First Thessalonians, because in First Thessalonians, Paul is explicit. Okay, he is urgent in his message, that the parousia is imminent; it will come soon. But in Second Thessalonians, the parousia it has been pushed back in the future. It is not as urgent. So if we take, if Second Thessalonians was written within a few months after, whereby Paul still have the vocabulary and the phrases still, and all his scribes will still have these phrases in their mind or in their heads and things like that. So how can Paul change his mind drastically? This is a problem. What other things could Paul have changed his mind that he did not tell us? And so evangelists do not want to open up this door, because it will only lead them to more problems. In the first place, why did Paul make a mistake? If Paul made a mistake, could his gospel have come directly from God? And so this is a question that evangelists themselves do not want to open up the doors for. Second thing, as Raymond Brown says here, the vocabulary in the opening remark leads more towards Ephesians and Colossians, whereby Ephesians and Colossians uses longer sentences compared to the undisputed Pauline letters, whereby the amount of sentences that occurs, the amount of longer sentences that occurs, or words per sentences have been described by Bartman in his book Forgery and Counter Forgery. He painstakingly, he copied the works of his predecessors on that, but he suggested or he listed the difference in vocabulary and the amount of words in the sentence and things like that. So it is drastically not Pauline. But leaving all that aside, okay, if we were to use arguments from the narrative itself, Raymond Brown here, I think, very strongly suggests that it makes better sense, or in fact, it only makes sense if the author of 2 Thessalonians, writing many years after Paul, again, I will return to this and I will present you another suggestion. But the first suggestion is that the authors, other than Paul, wrote many years after he wrote the book of Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. And so he has in front of him many of Pauline letters. Okay, many of these Pauline letters, and this is evidence from the text itself. Okay? The text itself basically says that this is how I do it. Okay, this is how I sign off. This is how I write. Okay, and so he must have in front of him Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Colossians, and that would suggest why we do find similarities in Thessalonians towards those other letters. Because if you were to say that 2 Thessalonians was written a few months after, then we do not have Romans, Corinthians, Colossians, Ephesians written during this time. They were written later, afterwards. And so it makes more sense to say that 2 Thessalonians was probably written much later because of the reference that he has, because of the reference that this is how I write in all of my letters. Okay. Now, some people have tried to flip this argument aside and say that Corinthians and Romans got their influence from 2 Thessalonians. And so this would suggest an early date in 2 Thessalonians. But this doesn't work. The reason why this doesn't work is because the claim that 2 Thessalonians made, that this is how I write in all of my letters, okay, meaning that Paul must have, or the author must have, Romans and Corinthians in front of him, and so that he could mimic the style and he could mimic the narrative. And so this is a highly more plausible, and we have evidence from the text itself. Whereas the other claim, the opposite claim, cannot be substantiated because there is lack of strong evidence to support it. Now, the second suggestion is probably Paul could have written 2 Thessalonians, okay, after he wrote Corinthians and all those other things. But then we cannot put it a date a few months after 1 Thessalonians was written. The last letter that Paul wrote is Romans, and so if we were to argue this way, then 2 Thessalonians must have been written after Romans. Okay, but then again, this will cause a huge problem, and none of the critical scholars would agree to this. that Paul wrote Second Thessalonians. Probably from where? From Rome, on his missionary journey, and things like that. So again, this will alter the chronology of Paul's life, his ministries, and letters. And so a lot of scholars do not even give this suggestion a very strong point, and for very good reason, because again, the evidence is very scarce. And so the more plausible evidence that we have, and Botterman argues in his book as well, that forgers would make the text very similar to the works that it is trying to forge. And this has been demonstrated in his first few chapters of his book. And Raymond Brown falls into the camp whereby Second Thessalonian is pseudonymous, okay, meaning it is a forgery. Um, and so does Dale Martin, and so does E.P. Sanders, and so does James Dunn, and a lot of all these other scholars. They are very critical scholars, they are distinguished scholars, and they simply do not agree with Michael Bird and N.T Wright in this manner. Now, my comment on N.T Wright's and Michael Bird's writings on page 420 and page 421. Just to be clear here, I'm commenting on their writings. I'm not commenting on them personally. I couldn't care less about any of these people I cite personally. It is their work that I'm concerning myself with. Okay. I believe that they have not really addressed the points that have been raised by their predecessors. For those who argue against the authenticity of Second Thessalonians, and this is very, very clear. In fact, if you read the points that they address, points 1 is on eschatology, point 2 is on literary features, point 3 is on authorial tone, point 4 is on marks of authenticity. All these points is like they're okay. It is understandable. Okay, it is an argument that is plausible. But the very point, the very strongest argument that they fail to address, the quote-unquote make or break argument that suggests whether First Thessalonians is authentically Pauline or not, is its second point, point number 2 on page 420, on literary features. This is the strongest point, and they have failed to address this, in my opinion. And I'm actually surprised that they actually built their argument based on false evidence, based on hypotheses, based on this is plausible and things like that. But I believe that in order for one to really establish a case, one really needs to go by the evidence that we have, because evidence is proof. Hypothesis is not proof. People can come out with thousands of hypotheses, and I could come out with a much better hypothesis than what they just come out with. So why not go and take that route? Since we are in the realm of hypothesis, so hypothesis cannot be used as evidence because it is hypothetical. There is no evidence. If there is an evidence to suggest so, then we do not need to be hypothetical. We can basically say, okay, this is the standard because we have evidence to support it. But the very fact that there is no evidence to support that Second Thessalonians was probably written a few months after, and the very narrative of Second Thessalonians actually refute those hypotheses by the very fact that the author probably have a lot of Pauline's letters in front of him, and so he is able to say, he is able to look at all of them and recognize a stylistic feature, and that is why he says that this is how I write, and he's writing in the name of Paul. This hypothesis, okay, we actually have evidence for, and so this is a much stronger hypothesis than to say that Second Thessalonians was probably written a few months after First Thessalonians, whereas there is no evidence. And so I encourage readers to weigh this for themselves. Um, again, um, people should always go by evidence, because if we were to take the academic route, then everything needs to be based on evidence. Because at the end of the day, no matter how great a scholar you are, everyone have the rights to question where you get that information from, um, and on what grounds or basis do you establish your case. And we can see here that both N.T Wrights and Michael Bird have not really established their case strongly. And I suggest you read this completely. And you read the entire chapters on Thessalonians, um, and to see whether I quote them out of context. I've tried my very best to not quote them out of context. And also, I would also suggest that you read Raymond Brown's work, Bart Ehrman's work, Dale Martin, James Dunn, E.P. Sanders' work. Why is it that a lot of these critical scholars whose work have been published by distinguished universities, why do they have a different opinion than Michael Bird and N.T Wrights? And now I'm not saying that majority wins here. All I'm saying is that the reason that this majority rejected that Second Thessalonian is probably written by Paul, because they have very strong evidence for their rejection. The same reason that they have very strong evidence for accepting the 7 authentic Pauline epistles. And that is because on the grounds and on the basis that the disputed and the rejected Pauline epistles, they differ in vocabulary, they differ in styles than the undisputed Pauline letters. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope this video have been fruitful for you, and I do not accept the opinion of N.T Wrights and Michael Bird, not because that I am pro for the non-authentic Pauline letters, like Second Thessalonians, for example. In fact, it doesn't make a difference to me. It doesn't make a difference to me. All I'm saying here is that we should be evidence-based. If we want to argue and build our case upon something, and if we really want to refute the other camp or to present a different opinion, then it is best that we do it based on evidence. And if the strongest arguments that we presented contains false evidence, and the very argument that could make or break the authenticity of Second Thessalonians, and if these counter arguments presented were not built on strong foundation, evidence-based foundations, okay, and not simply based on highly plausible scenario or a hypothesis that is highly plausible, then we cannot really say that this is how it is. Because if we look at the foundation of that argument, there is no evidence for it. And so you cannot build your sandcastles on sand and expect it to stay and not being washed by the tide and crumble to the ground. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Second Thessalonians still remain not authentically Paul to me, because the evidence is stronger that it is not authentically Paul than the evidence for it is authentically Paul. My name is Arfat, and I see you on my next one, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum.